In Ukraine, CBS News got a rare look inside a medical clinic on the front lines of the war, facing the devastating aftermath of controversial cluster bombings. Our Charlie D'Agata saw the real human impact that these weapons have up close at an undisclosed location in eastern Ukraine. And a warning, this report contains disturbing images.
Sipping a coffee at this shell of a clinic near the front lines, there's no telling what the day will bring for Dr. Alexei and his skeleton staff. This is a stabilization clinic, the first stop for wounded soldiers and civilians with one primary mission. We stabilize, so if there are heart failures or blood losses, he says, we bring the patient back to life and we take them further down the evacuation line. So they survive long enough to reach better equipped hospitals, the hours-long journey further away from the constant risk of Russian bombardment. There are explosions off in the distance, but then something much closer. There's a sudden urgency. Take someone with you and go check it out, Dr. Alexei orders. Secondary explosions ring out. Weary soldiers seem to know exactly what's happening. The first of the injured arrive. More soldiers, more gravely wounded. But then we watched as the civilians started coming, begging for help. Some unable to speak at all. About 20 minutes after we arrived, there's this huge explosion not more than 200 or 300 yards away, and ever since there's been this steady flow of wounded soldiers and civilians alike. We lost count of the number of people rushed through the doors. But it became clear this was an attack on a residential neighborhood. We have a cardiac arrest, shouts a medic. Heart stopped for 2 minutes. They're struggling to find room. Let's start compressions now. The overwhelmed clinic has quickly become a battlefield triage. In the chaos, life and death decisions between who may make it and who will not. This is the harsh reality of war. Shrapnel wounds, head injuries, chest injuries, limbs clamped with tourniquets to stop patients from bleeding to death. Wounds consistent with cluster bombs, Dr. Alexei tells us.
Because of your experience, can you be sure those injuries were from a cluster bomb?
Yes, they're used by the enemy a lot. It's not the first time and not the last.
We saw some of those horrific injuries. Is it fair to say that if they weren't treated here first, they might not have made it to the next hospital?
Yes, they wouldn't have made it. He says blood loss is enormous. In those injuries, the first thing is to put tourniquets on.
Did you lose some people today, too?
Yes, it's a war. He says people die. Despite the trauma, he says there's no time to be tired. He'll rest after the war.
Do you ever get angry?
For me, anger is like a motivating force, he says. I just point it in the right direction.
All right, Charlie, I want to ask you a little bit about this because obviously cluster bombs are in the news now. Ukraine has asked for them. The U.S. has agreed to send cluster bombs. As I understand it, both sides have already been using them. When I was watching the emergency crews go out and then come back, I thought to myself, it must also be incredibly dangerous for them to enter these scenes because of the nature of cluster bombs, that they don't always explode immediately.
It really is. One of the controversies is the toll, the potential toll it can have on the civilian population, and we have seen that for ourselves. We saw it
when we went to the clinic in eastern Ukraine. So there's the first impact where it just sprays these bomblets around into the civilian population. As you said, some of them go off, not all of them do. But on that first impact, it just sprays shrapnel in all directions along areas, the size of a couple football fields. And as you said, you've got the first responders or other people that come there. There's a delayed reaction in some cases with these bomblets. But then they can lie dormant for a number of years, even long after the war has ended. And people come upon them, children especially come upon them, and they are active bombs. And that's why, and try to clear an area like that is very difficult. And as you said, these are already being used. Certainly the accusations are there being used by Ukraine and Russia. I can tell you they're being used by Russia because we've seen mountains of these shells of these, the bombs, the cluster bombs, what's left of them. And there's plenty of evidence, even where we just came from now, which is in eastern Ukraine along the front line. So they're being used on a civilian population. You've seen the results of those cluster bombs. And then, of course, what happens after the war is over.
So clearly they are effective, but as you know, a number of countries have agreed never to use cluster bombs. What is the benefit on the battlefield? Why would the U.S. agree to provide them for Ukraine?
Yeah, Anne-Marie, it's a great question because we spoke to a commander. This is right along the front lines outside of Bakhmut, and we put that question to him. Do you need cluster bombs like these? And these are the kind of bombs that can be fired from the same sort of weapons, U.S.-supplied weapons that are already here, things like howitzers and HIMARS. So I said, what is the benefit of that? And he said, well, you can clear an area. There are minefields here that you could clear a minefield. And that's one of the things that's slowing down the offensive here. So you can use these bomblets to clear mines in order to detonate those areas. And of course, you can use them against armament. You can use them against Russian defenses. They're anti-personnel. That's savage to say, but if you want to try to break through Russian defenses, they're very effective. It's also a psychological weapon. These are terrifying weapons. No weapon is a good weapon in war. But the cluster bombs, when they come in, because they can cover such a wide area, they can be very effective in breaking down military defenses.
Your story was really hard to watch, Charlie, but it's just incredibly important that we recognize the damage being done, that this is not war by the numbers. Every number represents a human, a life, a family, a life torn apart. So I really appreciate your storytelling, Charlie. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne-Marie.